It was a cold and melancholic November afternoon in Chicago, a vibrant metropolis that never ceased to exude its characteristic energy, even on the quietest days. The streets were covered with a blanket of yellowed leaves, an unequivocal sign that winter was approaching. In the center of this urban landscape, Donald Trump emerged as an unmistakable figure. His long black coat, with a slight bluish tint, danced with the biting breeze, as if sharing in the grandeur of its wearer. The red tie, an inseparable icon of his public presence, stood out like a flame against the somber gray sky and the worn concrete of the surrounding buildings, as if he himself were a living contrast to the city's opaque atmosphere. He had just left a crucial meeting in a nearby skyscraper, where important discussions were shaping future plans, but instead of heading straight to the comfort of the waiting car, he chose to walk. Perhaps it was the need to feel the pulse of the city in its most authentic form, or maybe a premonition inviting him to immerse himself in the present moment. Thus, Donald Trump walked along the bustling Michigan Avenue, blending, unusually, with the constant flow of pedestrians. Despite this, his magnetic presence was unmistakable, and curious glances turned toward him, some recognizing his imposing figure, others merely intrigued by the aura he emanated. As he approached a busy corner, with Millennium Park glimpsed in the distance like a gray painting against the cloudy sky, something unusual happened. He stopped suddenly, as if an invisible force anchored him to that specific point. The honking of horns, the muffled sound of conversations, and the frantic pace around seemed to disappear, leaving only a strange and inexplicable sensation. Leaning against the facade of a majestic building, a solitary woman struggled against the wind that fiercely cut through the streets. Her figure seemed swallowed by the immensity of the city, but at the same time, there was something about her that emanated a silent cry impossible to ignore. Her face, aged by time and marked by hardships, bore traces of a painful history. Her worn clothes, with poorly made patches and tears that betrayed a long period of abandonment, seemed inadequate to face the rigor of that day. With thin, calloused fingers, she held a cardboard sign. The words written, though simple, carried an overwhelming weight. "Veteran in need, please help." People passed by her as if she were invisible, an uncomfortable detail that many preferred not to acknowledge. But not him. Abruptly stopping in the middle of the sidewalk, Trump stared intently at the woman, as if the glow of the storefronts and the vigor of the avenue were irrelevant in the face of that scene. There was something unsettling him, an inexplicable connection that seemed to transcend the circumstances of the moment. The woman's deep, weary eyes seemed to whisper stories of a life full of battles, victories, and defeats. For a moment, he stood still, absorbing the scene. But soon hesitation gave way to subtle determination, and he moved forward, attracting curious glances from passers-by. The woman, upon noticing his approach, reacted with a slight backward movement, the natural reflex of someone accustomed to abandonment. However, there was something in the way he slightly bent down, the almost unexpected gentleness of his movements, that made her stop. She looked at him surprised, trying to understand why someone like him, so detached from her reality, would care. "Ma'am, what is your name?" Donald Trump's voice, usually laden with authority, sounded softer this time, almost hesitant, as if trying not to scare the woman. She looked up, surprised. It was evident she did not expect anyone to stop, let alone someone as recognizable as him. It's Teresa," she replied with difficulty, her voice choked by years of suffering. He repeated the name with a slight emphasis. Teresa. It seemed he wanted to fix that name in his mind, as if it were something deeper than a mere encounter. In a rare gesture, he bent down to her level, kneeling on the cold, damp sidewalk. It was a posture that almost no one would imagine for someone like him. "You're a veteran, aren't you? Served in the army?" His question was direct, but there was respect in his tone, something that made her hesitate for a moment. "Homeless veteran," she corrected, in an almost imperceptible whisper. Shame seemed to weigh down her words. "I served in the army for 12 years. I was injured during a mission abroad. Since then, things have never been the same." Her eyes turned to the ground as if avoiding facing reality was easier. Trump remained silent for a few seconds, absorbing the weight of what he had just heard. The strength in her words struck him unexpectedly. The story of a woman who had dedicated years of her life to serving the country, now abandoned to her own fate, was a cruel contrast he couldn't ignore. "And why are you here, Teresa?" His voice carried an unusual empathy. "You have nowhere to go?" She shook her head slowly, the answer visibly difficult to articulate. "I lost my apartment months ago. I couldn't pay the rent. I'm trying to get back on my feet, but it's complicated." Her voice trembled, not just from the cold, but from the weight of the memories she carried. Her account provoked a deep discomfort in Trump. Someone who had given so much to the country shouldn't be in that situation. He took a deep breath, as if making a decision right there. Without saying anything, he took his phone out of his pocket and cast a determined look at Teresa. "Stay here," he said, his tone firmer, almost as if sealing a promise. With large steps, he stepped back slightly, focusing on the phone. The number dialed was answered almost immediately by the calm and efficient voice of Margaret, his former assistant, whose loyalty he had always valued. "Margaret," he began without beating around the bush, his voice now carrying evident urgency, "I need you to find the nearest hotel with immediate availability. Also, arrange for a doctor to come and evaluate her on site. It's urgent, understand? Tell them it's for me, Mr. Trump." Margaret did not question. The determination in her voice was clear, and he knew he could trust her to execute everything with precision. As she responded affirmatively on the other end of the line, he looked back, his eyes fixed on Teresa, who remained hunched against the wall. In that moment, Trump's emblematic figure seemed to have assumed a different role, not that of a businessman or politician, but of someone determined to make a difference, if only for a moment. Without hesitation, Margaret quickly confirmed, ensuring she would take care of everything with her usual efficiency. Trump hung up, the certainty that measures were underway reflected in his gaze. When he turned his attention back to Teresa, he found her eyes fixed on him, full of a mix of surprise, skepticism, and perhaps a timid hope still reluctant. She seemed incredulous at his attitude. After all, how many times does someone really stop to care? "Help is on the way," he said, his voice softer, as if trying to reassure her. There was an almost paternal tone in his words, something rare in his usual demeanor. "But before anything else, you need to eat something warm." He quickly looked around, his eyes identifying a nearby street food vendor. With a resolute nod, he called the man over. A few minutes later, he returned holding a steaming bowl of soup and a sandwich that exuded an inviting aroma. With careful gestures, he handed the food to Teresa, watching her attentively. Her hands, still trembling from the cold and exhaustion, held the food delicately. She began to eat slowly, almost as if she couldn't believe that the moment was real. The steam from the soup seemed to warm not only her hands, but also her expression, which gradually changed. The usual fatigue gave way to something different, gratitude. Trump remained silent as she savored each spoonful. His presence, always so striking, seemed in that moment discreet, as if he were absorbing the simplicity of that scene. Despite the constant noise of the city, there was a strange quietness in that instant. It was as if the world around had slowed down, allowing him to focus solely on Teresa. After a few minutes, while she was still eating, he broke the silence. "Tell me your story, Teresa. I want to know about your life in the army, your family. What brought you here?" His voice carried genuine curiosity, but also empathy, something unusual in his typical demeanor. It was evident that he wanted to understand, not just listen. Teresa hesitated for a moment, as if organizing her memories before sharing them. Then she took a deep breath and began to speak. Her voice was still marked by hesitation, but now it seemed firmer, as if the warmth of the soup had melted some of the barriers raised over the years. She described her years of military service, talking about missions carried out abroad and nights of camaraderie with her platoon mates. There was a nostalgic sparkle in her eyes as she recalled the friends she considered her family. However, the tone changed when mentioning the incident that had changed her life forever, a severe injury during a mission. "After that, nothing was the same," she said, her voice laden with melancholy. The injury not only ended her military career, but also brought a constant battle against physical and emotional pains. "The transition to civilian life was harder than I could have ever imagined," she admitted, looking down. You think you're prepared, but the truth is different. The lack of structure, the emptiness, the bills, everything starts to crumble. By the time I realized I had lost everything. Her eyes filled with sadness, but there was also a disarming sincerity in her words. Trump listened attentively, without interrupting. Every detail seemed to fuel a flame in his gaze, a determination that intensified as she shared her pain. Trump listened to every word Teresa said, with an almost uncommon attention for someone of his position. His face, usually rigid and calculated, now seemed to convey a mix of empathy and determination. Every detail of her story seemed to reach a deep part of his consciousness, as if echoing something he himself couldn't ignore. A few minutes later, the soft sound of tires on asphalt caught his attention. A black SUV, sleek and sturdy, pulled up near the sidewalk, its darkened windows reflecting the pulsating city lights. Margaret had been, as always, incredibly efficient. The uniformed driver quickly exited the car, moving with precision to open the rear door while awaiting instructions. Trump stood up and extended his hand to Teresa, with a gesture that, despite its simplicity, carried an unexpected kindness. "It's for you," he said in a tone that conveyed calmness and security. "We're going to take you to a safe place where you can rest and receive the help you need." His words were more than an offer. They were an implicit promise, as if he had decided to change the course of her history, no matter the cost. Teresa hesitated. Her eyes, once marked only by fatigue, now shone with a mix of disbelief and emotion. "Why are you doing this, Mr. Trump?" she asked, her voice broken by uncertainty. "You don't even know me." It was as if her mind was trying to process the unexpected, struggling to understand the altruistic gesture. Trump stared at her firmly, his eyes carrying an intensity rarely witnessed. "Because someone needs to," he replied simply. And in that short sentence there was a raw truth, a silent acknowledgement of the times she had been ignored by everyone. As the SUV moved through the city streets, the surrounding scene seemed to flow like a blur. Teresa remained silent, still processing everything that had happened. A few minutes later, the vehicle stopped in front of a reserved location, a luxurious building she would have never imagined stepping into. At the entrance, a small team awaited her, courtesy of Margaret's efficiency. Each team member seemed to treat Teresa with respectful reverence, as if she were an important figure deserving of all attention. She was escorted to a suite on the top floor, where the warm reception continued. The environment seemed straight out of a fairy tale. A hot bath was already prepared, exuding a relaxing aroma. New, clean clothes were carefully folded on a leather armchair, and a soft, inviting bed awaited her, like a sanctuary against years of suffering and cold nights. Shortly after the doctor arrived, his demeanor was professional, but there was something in his tone of voice and approach that conveyed more than medical care. He wanted to restore in her a sense of dignity. After examining her, he brought medications to alleviate her physical pains and comforting words that seemed to ignite something that had long been extinguished. Teresa, though still confused by everything, began to feel a spark of hope. Meanwhile, Margaret remained in action. She had called Veterans United Services, a renowned organization for helping homeless veterans rebuild their lives. In less than an hour, Lisa, a representative from the organization, arrived at the location. With a welcoming smile and an optimistic demeanor, Lisa sat beside Teresa and gently held her hands. "Teresa," she said in a gentle but firm tone, "we're going to help you. We'll work to secure your housing, offer professional training, and everything else you need. You're no longer alone." Lisa's words seemed to carry an almost magical weight. Teresa, who until then carried the look of someone defeated by circumstances, blinked slowly, as if absorbing the truth in those promises. And for the first time in a long while, a solitary tear rolled down her face, not out of sadness but relief. Lisa's words pierced the emotional barriers Teresa had built over the years, releasing a torrent of tears she could no longer hold back. It was as if the invisible armor she carried was finally breaking down, exposing the accumulated pain from years of abandonment and struggle. Her sobs were silent but deep, echoing through the environment like a cry of relief. Slowly she raised her eyes toward Trump, who remained silent, standing in a corner of the room. His posture was still imposing, but there was a subtle vulnerability in his expression, as if this moment also touched him personally, perhaps more than he himself expected. "Thank you, Mr. Trump," Teresa said, her voice choked with emotion. The words came out simply, but carried the weight of genuine gratitude that transcends any formality. Something in that moment seemed to change, as if the burden she carried had been, albeit partially, redistributed. Trump took a step forward, his firm figure contrasting with the gentle tone in his eyes. "You don't need to thank me, Teresa," he replied, his voice laden with compassion. "This isn't charity. It's the least someone like you deserves. What we're doing here isn't a favor. It's a right you should have had a long time ago." He paused briefly, as if reflecting on the reality that had brought them to that instant. "Tomorrow," he continued, his voice firm with an implicit promise, "your life will change. Trust me." The next morning, that promise began to materialize. Veterans United acted swiftly and efficiently, finding temporary housing that would serve as a starting point for Teresa. But that was just the beginning. Trump, true to his word, intervened personally to eliminate any immediate financial concerns. Through his foundation, he committed to paying Teresa's rent for an entire year, ensuring she had a safe and stable space to get back on her feet. As if that weren't enough, he surprised her with a generous check, intended to cover urgent expenses and provide her with financial relief as she adjusted her life to the new reality. As Trump prepared to leave, Teresa took a hesitant but determined step forward. There was a different sparkle in her eyes, a mix of gratitude, hope, and something more, a newly discovered strength. "Mr. Trump," she began, her voice still choked with emotion, "there aren't enough words to describe what you've done for me. You didn't just change my life, you gave me the chance to start anew. Thank you from the bottom of my heart." Trump smiled slightly, but there was something deeper in his expression. It wasn't just satisfaction from the gesture made, but a greater sense of responsibility, as if that act was only part of something more significant. He looked at Teresa, his eyes fixed on hers, and responded firmly, "I know you're going to achieve great things, but I want to ask something in return." Teresa tilted her head, surprised, but before he could continue, she replied with a determination that seemed to emerge from a renewed inner strength. "I promise to give back," she said, her voice now firm and full of conviction. It was a declaration of purpose, a commitment to the new life she had just received. In that moment, something changed, not only for Teresa, but also for those who witnessed her transformation. A seed of hope was planted, showing that even in the darkest circumstances, a simple act of kindness can trigger a redemption that transcends the person being helped, inspiring everyone around. As Trump left the hotel, returning to the pulsating hustle of the city, his demeanor carried an uncommon serenity. It wasn't the kind of moment he would share with cameras or turn into headlines. It was something more intimate, a gesture that to him seemed more important to feel than to display. The weight of that encounter still resonated in his mind. He knew that within hours, he had done more than change practical circumstances in Teresa Hensley's life. He had reignited something deeper in her, a sense of belonging, value, and purpose that time and adversity had almost erased. For Teresa, that day represented much more than a roof, clean clothes, or a generous check. It was the moment when she, for the first time in years, felt seen, as if her existence mattered again. The world, which once seemed only a scene of constant struggle, now began to open up with possibilities she never imagined having again. Every word of encouragement, every gesture of support, seemed to pave the way for a future that was previously just a forgotten dream. And so the story came to an end, but its impact would continue to echo in ways that words and numbers couldn't measure. Moments like this are a powerful reminder that the simple act of reaching out can transform not only a life, but create waves of inspiration and hope for many. Thank you for staying with us until here. If this story touched your heart as much as it touched ours while telling it, we invite you to be part of this chain of hope. Like this video, share it with your friends, and help us spread messages that transform. And of course, subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell to never miss exciting and inspiring stories like this one. May your day be blessed and full of meaning. Until next time.